Filipino Panabas versus Dacian Falx. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now recently I did a video about this obscure weapon in my obscure weapon playlist. Check that out if you haven't done already. And this is the Panabas from the Philippines. Now I'll put the Falx down for a second. A number of people made some interesting comments about the Panabas, some of which I knew and I just didn't cover in my video, some things which maybe I wasn't that aware of. So one thing I wasn't that aware of was that these, or simplified forms of these, are still used today in the Philippines for chopping down vegetation. So they are used as general purpose tools. And in fact, there's always this fuzzy line between what we call a tool and what we call a weapon, and I'm going to come back to that point in a bit. But some people said, Matt, is this like the Falx, or how does it compare to the Falx? Well, obviously this is a relatively modern weapon, it's still being made, but they were being used certainly in the 19th, 18th century. This is probably a 19th century, possibly very early 20th century example, antique example. And what I have here is a Dacian Falx, or a replica of one, made by Amandi Knife, and I'm going to put a link below to them because they sent this to me years ago very kindly, and I did feature it in a couple of videos already. But it is going to be used in weapon testing, which I know is very behind schedule against a Roman helmet and things like that, because there's lots of questions to be answered there. But the Dacian Falx actually isn't necessarily just one weapon, okay? There are various, obviously the on fire as well, there's various forms of weapon which are like this from that region of, or that general area of the world, not just from Dacia, actually expands beyond modern Romania, and it was sometimes used by Thracians and things like this. There are one-handed versions, there are small versions, there are giant, bigger versions, but fundamentally they share one common characteristic, and that is they have a forwards curving blade. Now, as I mentioned in my Panabas video, you'll notice the Panabas has a backwards curving blade. Indeed, there do seem to be some varieties which do have forwards curving blades, but the vast majority are backwards curving. And as I mentioned in that video, the Wikipedia page described these as having a forwards curving blade and making them therefore like a kukri. Completely wrong, and my heart has been warmed by the fact that since I put my video up, literally like 24 hours later, someone kindly went in and edited Wikipedia to now describe this as a backwards curving blade. So fantastic, whoever did that out there. I doff my cap to you, well done for updating Wikipedia. It does now make my previous video somewhat, that comment obsolete anyway, because Wikipedia has now been corrected. Anyway, so this is a backwards curving blade, this is a forwards curving blade. But they clearly share some characteristics. What you've essentially got is a blade that is somewhere between 1 and 2 feet long, usually, sometimes longer than that, and with a grip which isn't really long enough to qualify it as a pole arm, but is longer than a typical sword. Now, what am I talking about? Well, I'm going to grab a couple of things here as illustrative points. So, first up, a pole arm would be something like this Danax, where clearly the majority of the weapon is a shaft, and then you have some kind of blade at the end. I also happen to have an antique naginata blade here, and things like the naginata or the naginata or the nagamaki from Japan, or various types of glaive might be examples where you've got a very long blade, but even still in most examples, the hilt, or the pole, or the handle, if you want to call it that, is longer than the blade usually. The nagamaki can be an exception to that, of course. So I would call these weapons pole arms in general, okay? However, a weapon where you've essentially got a long handle but an even longer blade is obviously slightly more akin to swords. I'm just going to grab, however, from behind the camera, an example here of an antique Burmese da, and you'll notice the da has a very, very long grip on it. This gives it a unique type of movement style and balance to it that's a little bit different, feels very different in the hand to most swords because you've got such a long grip. And a lot of people might look at these, and archaeologists, for example, if we didn't have any more recent evidence, might look at this and go, it's a two-handed weapon. But in fact, we know in the case of Burmese and Thai and Vietnamese swords, even though they have got a long grip, they are predominantly one-handed swords. There's a parallel to be made here with the medieval German Langmesser as well, which often has a long grip, and this is used for hooking and leverage and things like this, not usually used for two-handed grips. So, the Falx, on the other hand, we know was used two-handed, okay, most of the time, although they're one-handed versions. The Panabas could be used one or two-handed, but they were both sometimes used two-handed. So what we're going to refer to these are essentially types of two-handed sword. Okay, now the big difference between these two, however, is clearly one is a backwards curving blade and one is a forwards curving blade. So to answer the question, I'm going to get straight to the point. What is the difference between the Falx and the Panabas? Fundamentally, that's the main difference. They are functionally very, very similar things otherwise. So the Panabas is curved like a sabre away from the thing you're striking. The Falx is curved towards the thing you're striking. Now, I have talked about backwards curving blades and forwards curving blades in the past occasionally, but for anyone who hasn't seen previous videos, fundamentally the difference between those two things is a forwards curving blade scoops everything into this curve and hacks, and a curved blade draws, it still hacks into, but then it draws through and out. What does that mean? What's the functional difference? Both of these things provide an angle to the thing you're striking at and therefore increase the chopping, hacking, cutting potential. What do I mean by that? Well, let's just grab that naginata blade for a second. So if we're striking something here, the blade is straight, okay? But if we strike at an angle, that edge bevel, okay, which is say it's 40 degrees, if we angle that at 45 degrees, that edge bevel is now only 20 degrees because we've halved the angle here. Okay, so anything that strikes at an angle to the thing it's hitting at, either forwards or backwards, is essentially reducing the edge bevel angle, thereby reducing the resistance, therefore cutting more deeply into the target with less friction. Okay, so fundamentally things which curve in relation to the thing they're hitting increase the cutting potential and effectiveness and penetration of the blade into the target. You can simulate this incidentally with a straight blade. Let's grab a straight blade off the wall. Okay, so if you want to increase the cutting potential of your straight sword, if you angle it slightly and hit the target at an angle, just as I did with that naginata blade there a second ago, okay, you will increase the slicing effect. But obviously a curved blade, forwards or backwards, can accentuate this even more, or do it naturally with a maximum straight reach of the arm without having to sink the arm in and reduce your effective reach. So both of these blades, whether they're forwards curved or backwards curved, have increased cutting potential. However, they react on the target after the moment of impact and penetration into the target in a different way. You may have noticed a tool known as a sickle, or another tool known as a scythe. Now the reason they are forwards curved is because when you're scything crops or grass, whatever you happen to be cutting, it scoops all of that stuff into the centre of the blade, gathers it together and lops it off. Okay. Similarly, a sickle does the same thing, but usually it's a shorter implement, but it does exactly the same thing. A Falx has, firstly, it has a second effect as well, but has firstly that effect. So in other words, when you chop with a Falx, it has a tendency of, if you hit up here, for example, the meat or helmet or whatever you happen to be, a wood could be anything, that whatever you hit tends to come down the blade and slide down this way into the centre of the blade. So if you hit out at the tip, it will cut inwards and be acting as a push cut in towards the centre of the blade. With a curved blade, it's the complete opposite. You would tend to hit here and then the blade would naturally drag through and out this way. So that is a draw cut. So essentially one is a push cut, one's a draw cut, but they both have the same slicing effect. They both strike at an angle on the moment of impact and then draw in or draw out. In reality, in combat, that actually has two opposite effects, which are very important to know if you're going to use these weapons for fighting. Okay, one of the reasons most curved weapons, and particularly swords and cavalry swords, curve away from the target is because when you hit the target, the weapon hacks in, draws out, and is now free to use again, which means that these sorts of weapons are easy to keep in action. When you chop into a target, it draws out and carries on. For that reason, when we've got a weapon like a talwar, for example, here, an Indian sword, curved blade after the earlier Persian models essentially, these, whether they're used on horseback or foot, have the ability to hack into a target and then draw out and be free again to hack again and again and again and again and again. And if you're riding on a horse quickly past, hit in, draw out and straight through, and it's free. That means it's free to attack another opponent, hit the same opponent again, or to defend yourself or do whatever. A straight blade is more likely to stop on the target, and a forwards curved blade, whilst it might have a formidable hack, is more likely to get stuck on or in the target. In some situations, the added chopping potential of the forwards curving blade might be worth that trade-off. The fact that it gets stuck in the target might be beneficial in some way. The fact is, we all know that kukris are incredibly effective weapons. There are ways to free the weapon as well, even if you hack into a target and it gets stuck, because remember you might have hit there and then the target slides down to here and is now embedded on this part of the blade. You can, of course, at that point pull the blade out, which might do even more damage. You can, of course, twist it to get it out in some cases and go again. So there are ways that you can free your target. I'm not going to say it's like permanently stuck in the target or anything like that, but it does change the way you fight. However, one final thing I want to say about the Falx, which is, you could say, an advantage over the Panabas. You could say the Panabas is better at slashing and staying in motion and keeping moving and keeping going. However, while the Falx is more likely to get stuck, you have one very important feature of the Falx which was very pertinent for the Dacians when they were fighting the Romans, and it is that you have a very focused little tip or beak that is a little bit like a pick or a warhammer for striking into or around armour. Okay, so into and around are two different things. Firstly, by focusing on a point there, if you strike onto the top of someone's helmet with that point over the top of their shield, and I'll come back to that point in a second, if all of the force of your weapon and your blow and your body and movement and everything else go into that tip, they are more likely to penetrate the, in that period, iron or bronze helmet through the top into the Romans' head and put them out of action and potentially kill them outright. And for this reason, we know that in the Dacian campaigns, the Romans introduced certain extra armour, manica armour for the right arm, for the sword arm, but also cross pieces on the top of the helmet, allegedly, to help protect against this. Because their helmets worked fine against swords, worked fine against spears, but as soon as someone came along with something that essentially worked a little bit like a warhammer at the tip, it could come over and penetrate their armour on the tip, okay, on the top. So penetration is one thing. Around is also an important thing, because what did the Romans also use apart from armour? Big shields, scuta, scutum, a singular, scuta plural. And clearly to get around the shields, very difficult with a sword or a spear. Certain type of Thracian Roman gladiator used a weapon called a sicut, which is a curved sword inspired by weapons like this. So it was specifically designed to get around the Roman shield. So the fact is, the Roman legionary, who's used to defending against straight weapons, suddenly with a forwards curved weapon, bam, you can snipe, head snipe, what the German longsworders would call a Scheitelhau, over the top of the person's shield, okay, and maybe around the side of the shield, down at their kneecap or shin or leg. So in other words, this forwards curve has other tactical advantages. Yes, it cuts very horribly. Yes, it might get stuck on a target and doesn't draw through as well as a backwards curved blade, but it's more likely to penetrate armour or anything else it hits, and it's more likely to get around a shield, okay? So there we go. There's a quick fly-through comparison of the Panabas and the Falx. In some ways, very similar in their proportions, their weight, this kind of thing, but fundamentally very different by virtue of the fact that the Falx is forwards curved and the Panabas is backwards curved. And forwards curved and backwards curved have In one way, similar effects on the target, and in another, fighting sort of tactical sense, very, very different methods of use. So this is an original antique example, but thanks again to Iamandi for sending this amazing, who are based in Dacia in Romania, incidentally, so it's a Romanian replica sword from Romania. How cool is that? For sending this originally, and it will feature in future videos. Any more questions about the Falx, or indeed about the Panabas, get posting below. If you would like them compared to any other specific weapon, then let me know. But I hope that's been interesting food for thought for now. I am Matt Easton, and I will be again next time as well. I hope I'll see you back here really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.